Hello and welcome to another recruitment discussion from Jump Advisory. And what a discussion this week will be. It's one that, again, we've been hotly anticipated, lots of people asked for. But before we kick off, let's do the now traditional video conference protocol. Can you hear me? If you can, let's put a comment in the chat box or the question box, so I know there's actually people listening. So Paul Jacobs gets very worried that no one's ever listening to him, which is like 24/7 every day for him. So today we're going to be covering what's becoming one of the most important topics on every boardroom table probably across the land: the future of flexibility working and how hybrid working can affect your mental health. We all know that working from home has sort of definitely taken its toll on our mental health and our relationship across the nation. As the UK government continues to encourage those to work from home that can, a new survey came out that 80% of all Brits feel that working from home has had a negative impact on their mental health. We've now been sort of physically separated from our colleagues, and that's caused a huge sort of dynamic change in how we work and the workplace. And as the roadmap for the lockdown starts to unravel and the journey ahead starts to look at, the need to consider hybrid working as a genuine working strategy is really important. The pros and the cons are there. We all know, the difference between sort of the commute versus no commute, spending time with your family versus not wanting to spend time with your family potentially. Okay, we all know these things are sort of going on. But when we start to think about it, 25% of people who said working from home say that loneliness and isolation from their colleagues had truly affected their mental health. So today we're joined by Lisa Kramer, who is a business psychologist from Kooth. Kooth were the first mental health company to float on the stock market. Their sole purpose was to create ease to access online mental health services that work alongside the UK businesses to provide compassionate and effective support. They've over 200 counsellors and emotional wellbeing practitioners. So they're literally at the heart of the UK business, providing compassionate support to companies and people who need it. So Lisa, welcome. Thank you very much for your time. It's much appreciated. So as usual, guys, if you've got any questions, please ask the questions as we go along. But before we kick off, Lisa, do you want to introduce yourself and what you've been doing before we ask the first question?
Yes, smashing. Thank you, Howard. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. What a lovely introduction. So my work is, as you say, a business psychologist, and I'm working in-house at Kooth, but I've had an interesting career to that point. So I worked as a communicator, did an economics degree and worked in the bank in London, in the city, and in various financial PR institutions, and had a huge communication role for a while before running my own business, and then realized that actually many people that I spoke to had the same problem. The same problem was trying to engage your employees into such a position that actually it will be beneficial for your organizational outcomes. So I did the relevant conversion courses and masters to get recognized by the British Psychological Society, and have worked at a leadership consultancy and then in a charity before making my way to Kooth. And this area obviously fascinates me completely, and I think it's just so incredibly topical now, just how we need to see our mental health and see ourselves as holistic people, and how that the balance, or rather imbalance, of our work lives and our home lives, and how we need to address that going forward.
So if we look at that then, Lisa, and look at the work-life balance, and as you say, the imbalance, from a business perspective, what stresses and strains has really COVID put people under?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I think in order to do that, we probably need to have a quick look and see what kind of pressures people were under pre-COVID, and then look at what's happened to us during this period of the pandemic and lockdown. And so where are we effectively in our mental state as we come out of COVID? Well, the pandemic's still on, but you know what I mean, as we start to go back into work. So looking at some of the data that we've got here, well, essentially pre-COVID, we had the technological stresses in our lives. We had access to information all the time, computers, mobiles, we could respond to emails. There was, email etiquette, you had to respond within a certain time period, otherwise people thought you were rude or you weren't on it. So there was an element of huge amounts of burnout and this pressure to keep up with the technological state that we were in. So we already had that. And then, of course, we've got our own mental health presentation, which, we are who we are, and our own propensity to having poor or good mental health. You then go into this sort of lockdown state, and you have all of those issues. For those of us who were lucky enough to keep our jobs and work through the pandemic but work from home, we had those technological issues. We were always on, but then people were just sort of, I think I saw a stat, people were doing 48 more minutes on average per day because they were just at home and they just could. So that always on culture just kind of never stopped. So we had that additional pressure, but then you have to see what's happening mentally in terms of being in this lockdown state. So looking at the data that we captured at Kooth, there was an increase in adults that were logging in that were saying that they were presenting with feelings of loneliness and isolation, and that then meant that they had feelings of sadness and anxiety, some health anxiety coming out there. There were sort of physiological things that were happening to them in terms of eating difficulties and sleeping difficulties, and you can see that that's impacting on all sorts of parts of their lives. So this work-life imbalance was becoming incredibly raw. Relationships were under pressure because of the additional pressures of their mental health was having in their lives. And unfortunately for some people, we were seeing that these suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation was then sadly leading into suicidal acts. And it's an interesting concept to think that we had come from a already pressurized work-life balance to what is now becoming somewhat of a work-life imbalance with the additional pressure of mental health issues.
So it's interesting when we sort of look at it like that there's an awful amount that's sort of happening sort of in the background that we hadn't sort of really realized that sort of COVID brought to the forefront. And as you say there, that relationship issues, family issues, emotional strain, suicidal thoughts is something that sort of become, really, really big, especially among the male community. It's become a real big sort of talking topic. Paul, you were sort of wanted to sort of ask a question on that as well.
Well, I mean, I think you make some great points here, Lisa, and I think we've all been affected by, you make the point about always on status. I mean, I'm acutely aware that my commute to work now takes me about 10 seconds, from the bedroom or kitchen to my office. And therefore I am, as it were, working at an earlier point in the day and working later and so forth. And there's virtually no break up during the daytime. I've always been a workaholic. This isn't exactly news to me, but I think I've coped pretty well. But I know in talking to a lot of my clients that trying to get that balance, you've called it a work-life imbalance, has been a real challenge for them. And I'm imagining that has sort of been, for you, something you've been very focused on in terms of trying to get people to be more, to address this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see that there's the work-life spillover means that people are feeling just too stressed to unwind after work. And, even if you sort of suggest that people go for a walk or try and have that separation of space, so they put their computer away and literally lock it away so that you're not tempted. I do it. I did it last night. I checked my computer at 11:30. Who is texting me or emailing me at 11:30?
I think we were actually.
I can't wait till this morning. I'm just so tempted to do it. And this is just really bad. I notice it in myself that there's a huge amount of burnout and it's just exhaustion. And you have to be able to try and, as employers, encourage your staff to make those breakaway movements, either physically and even mentally. Your work finishes now. We'll come on to this a little bit later, but it's just in terms of, you won't be necessarily clocked by your 9 to 5 presence in the office, because even your virtual presence, it might move towards a sort of productivity element. So I just trust you to get the work done. If you want to do it at 11 o'clock at night, good luck to you, but then you can have a line in the morning because you deserve it, because actually you're getting the work done. So it's those sorts of transitions that might be able to, reduce that element of imbalance.
Well, I think it's an interesting point, bearing in mind our audience are all recruiters, recruitment business owners and so forth. I think we've been saying for a very long time that in many respects, our industry has been moving to this sort of 24/7 environment now. And, our candidates are more capable, as it were, of talking to us during evenings than during their work time. So I think what we're seeing are people now, as you say, splitting up their days, maybe taking a break during the daytime, maybe working later to connect with people when it's convenient for them. So in some respects, and it depends as ever with these things, if you look at it from a positive perspective, rather than the negatives that you've highlighted, there's some really good things that actually can come out of this if you can correct and just address the balance as you've described.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. It's a huge element of trust that goes with that relationship. So, you know, from a business psych perspective, if you want to put a label on it, it's called the leader member exchange relationship. So how are you working with your immediate line manager, and then how are you working together as a group, as a team? So the, you know, the objectives and your key sort of reporting stats, so long as people know as a group you have to do this project, as long as it gets delivered on time, then effectively people don't need to know, I need to have 4:30 off to go and see the doctor. It's like life's moved on. You know, we need to trust our staff and trust each other to be able to perform at that level.
And there's the key word, which we'll come back to shortly, I suspect, trust. And I think that's something that maybe we could talk on. I see the slide in front of us says trauma. So I kind of feel that I want to ask you a question. We hear about it all the time in the news. As a nation, have we suffered from what you might call mass trauma? Do you feel that as a group, as a sort of 67 million people, have we collectively suffered now from a level of trauma that you could call mass trauma over the last 12 months?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I do always worry about putting words that have clinical associations into everyday lexicon, because I do worry about that, because, you know, if you were looking at it from a clinical setting, trauma follows a certain amount of, you know, presentations, and then your reaction to post-traumatic stress also follows through in the same way. But principally, have we all been in a situation where, you know, we've had uncertainty, we've had huge amounts of change, our liberties have changed, we've been asked to wear masks and stay away from each other and be locked down? Then yes, I mean, to some extent we have, you know, experienced trauma. And clearly, you know, even if you're living it immediately, which some people have, or vicariously through like the group collectiveness of the trauma that's, you know, what's happened to the population at large, there's an argument to say that we have lived through what is a traumatic experience.
What are the long-term impacts, do you think, Lisa? I mean, how do you see things sort of moving forward as we hopefully start to get a bit more freedom? What sort of impact do you think, potentially from a sort of long-term perspective, is there likely to be?
I mean, it's really, it's so fascinating that you asked that question, because this is kind of where the conversation is turning. If we've had a traumatic experience, and if we're looking at our mental health, and if we're trying to recognize that as people in the workplace, we're bringing into the workplace our physical health and our mental health, then how on earth are we going to be a productive workforce against that backdrop? And, you know, this is really something that we have to look at and address. And so, you know, the statistics here are just useful to be able to back up the point that I'm making, which is, you know, it's the bottom column there, and the middle box on the bottom line and the one on the right hand side really are the ones that I want to draw your attention to. And this is to say, if we're looking at this is data that's coming from Kooth, so it's not everybody in the entire, you know, UK clearly, but, you know, from the people that we're seeing, if these are representing the workforce as a representative, 28% of them are experiencing suicidal thoughts. You know, up to 87% on year stats compared to last year pre-COVID are saying that they're sad. You know, there's lots of loneliness, lots of anxiety, up by 54%. These people are then coming into the workplace, and as the figure on the right hand side say, people are having increased problems at work. Well, of course they are, because their head's not in it. Well, they're trying their best, but because we've been through this traumatic experience, because we've got all those, you know, imbalances going on at home and all those other mental health issues that are compounding into something greater, then we are presenting ourselves in the workplace with some difficulties. We have, as the stat there says, you know, 24.4% are saying, look, I've just lost my motivation, I'm just not interested that much in work. And so as employers, from a business psychological perspective, what do we do with that? How do we then help our employees stabilize? And what support can we give them so that they continue to be the best that they can, the best versions of themselves? It's good for them anyway, and it's good for the business.
So has this changed how you think managers actually work with their staff? There's a very big sort of divide between those who manage and those who coach, the big stick approach versus the nurturing type approach. Do you think then this has had a huge effect on how we should be managing our staff to develop the future of the company and the individual?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting debate, and it's sort of, feeds into sort of a leadership debate. Would you go down the compassionate leadership or transformational leadership route? I think that the problem for organizations is that they automatically then think that all their line managers have to be like amateur psychologists, that now all of a sudden they need to have in their toolkit this extra level of aptitude in order to be able to look after their staff. That is quite a big ask, and I'm not sure that everybody really has the skills to be able to do that. I do think that compassionate conversations are the way forward. I do think that we need to train our staff and train each other in terms of how to look out for the signs of things that may be mental health presentations, that perhaps, although we might not be able to deal with them directly, that we know where to signpost people onto, and just encourage this positive workplace culture that supports staff and supports staff well-being. I think organizations want to do it. I think they just need to know how.
And Lisa, I mean, I'm just, we talk about, you've got a slide here with some pretty worrying statistics. When you look at this, 13% of students, for example, considering suicide. It's just awful. And we look at some of the other statistics here, and it's an important point to make, that when we look at these statistics, this is not fable. These are people who work in environments. Many of these people are working in our environments, in our recruitment businesses. They're people that work in our companies. They're our candidates. They're the people, our clients, the people we talk to on a daily basis. This is not imaginary. This is real. And I mean, every one of us is probably connected to any number of people who are suffering from, to a greater or lesser degree, some of these symptoms, probably without our knowledge. How do you, as an employer, make sure to the best of your ability that you're in touch with your people and indeed your clients to ensure that you can provide the sort of correct support? What sort of questions should we be asking people?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think we need to, before we start to ask the questions, I think we need to just go one stage further back, which is creating a culture, which, by the way, is very difficult to change in an organization, but to create this culture of safety and well-being being at the heart of the organization, and that the people in it and the people that you are dealing with, like in your organizations with the candidates, their well-being is at the center of your policy making and your decision making. And only when you're in a position of what we would call psychological safety can you then do this second part, which actually answers the question, Paul, which is asking the right questions in a way that doesn't feel interrogatory, or you have to know how this is going to land, because all of a sudden people feel that they're asking the right questions, but it could just land way off base, and that doesn't help anybody. So you have to create what we would say is that psychological safety, and in some ways the psychological contract. This is what I expect you to do for me, and in return this is what I will do for you. And in amongst that safe space we will be exploring this, and if you can have that relationship already, then it makes having these conversations much easier. The other way to do it, if that is not very easy, is to make it part of, I've seen organizations that try to make well-being conversations part of their performance evaluation. So if you're going to get an appraisal, you would have either a check-in with your EAP or with the well-being officer or the mental health first aider, and that then becomes part of your appraisal process, just so people keep an eye on it. I think there's a very interesting point just to add further, that you have these engaged people and disengaged people, and so it's easy to see who is operating well and appears to tick the boxes and they're fine. But then you've got this bit in the middle, which is the sort of non-engaged. So they're doing what they're meant to be doing, and if you ask them a question, how are you? How's your mental health? They'll probably say, yeah, fine, because they don't particularly want to talk to you about it. It's getting to them that is actually the real challenge for organizations.
It's quite interesting when you sort of look at that. I always call that the Smokey Robinson sort of effect, the tears of the clown when there's no one around, because people sort of tend to sort of blanket that off. We've been asked a question from, Ramadeep, that three sort of sections to the question. To what extent as a business do we continue to support when we work in a reactive business environment? And then we need to protect the business as well as ourselves, but what timeframes do you work to, and how do you establish to identify the need and support required?
Okay, fantastic questions there. And I think that really comes from a position of, we talk about return on investment or the value of investment. How far can people be supporting staff who are clearly struggling? So in terms of the timelines, each person goes through something different at any one point in time. So, contextually, things will change. So I think it would be very difficult to say you've got 3 months to get yourself better, otherwise we're going to have performance review and manage you out of the business. I think that's a very delicate situation, but I do think that you can go through tangible steps, which is I feel like your work hasn't been so great this week, can we just talk to you about it, and perhaps find reasons for that are sort of less accusatory and more sort of compassionate and working alongside you and collaborative, and then you sort of go through those stages. And I think the key to all of it would be to know at what point does your not empowerment but your scope ends, at which point you then have to signpost on to people who have the skills to be able to take this presentation and this person with whatever issue they have into a more safe space.
So that's probably the difference between managing by dictatorial manners and coaching to nurture people, but then understanding where your capabilities stop and when you should be handing that over to someone that's got more capability than you to actually deal with that situation.
And I think absolutely, and I think the important thing for line managers, because in this situation you can imagine people want to do the best job they can, but then they just don't know where else to turn. And I think within organizations, if there is somebody who is that identified person who says, I will do what I can with my line report, but when I get to a point where I don't know where else to turn, these are the policies in place, this is the wellbeing strategy we have in place, and these are the places that we can signpost. And then that would be your mental health first aider or your wellbeing officer, who is going to help you work alongside your internal employees to make sure that you can manage whatever presentations are coming. Because I do think that we can do as much as we can, but there is a point at which you have to get professional help or get guidance.
Yeah, Lisa, I mean, we talked I said we'd revisit the word trust, and I think trust is a very important point here, that, a lot of our listeners are SMEs, so they don't have, layers of HR or support in their businesses, and they're very hands-on people. I think there's a question of trust here. If your employees, if your colleagues trust you, or they trust other people around them, then potentially that's the space where you can approach people, where there is that level of a bond, if you like. People are prepared to be open with you. I guess there's also a fine line here in terms of, from a legal perspective, what sort of, is there some level of sensitivity in terms of the questions you can or cannot ask? Because I think if you are too intrusive with questions, that could be crossing the line. At the same time, you've got to be asking questions in a very subtle fashion to identify potential issues. So that it's a very tricky situation, I suppose, has to be handled extremely sensitively, as you said.
Yes, absolutely. And, I wouldn't want to, talk about the legal mindful that goes along with that, because, we were talking about it in another conversation, even in regards to somebody who feels that they're being bullied or not bullied. You could have a situation where your manager, in the nicest will in the world, asks you a question that just, as we say, just doesn't land properly, and then you take it to HR and it becomes very messy. And that was never the point of the conversation. So you're right, it does need delicate manhandling. And interestingly enough, not everybody has the skills to do it. I think it takes a certain type of person to do it. And I think really, if you don't have the skills to do it, that's fine. You do not need to do this. What I think you do need to do is, within even a small organization, look around at the staff that you have, who is prepared to be that person who is going to have these conversations, and just kind of keep an eye on your staff and be a well-being lead. That in itself is able to be done within most organizations. Yep. And it can be done even at the smallest SME, really, I think.
Yeah.
Lisa, you've spoken, we've spoken about trust, we've spoken about imbalances and extra levels of skills. And of course, all of this is change for people. So what are some of the sort of emotional responses that you're seeing to change?
Yes. So yeah, this curve actually it's used for a grief curve, for people who've gone through bereavement, but it's actually really apt to use here in regards to how people react to what we've been through. And so there will be people there at the left-hand side who are in a bit of shock and denial. And then as you go through the curve, they go through this sort of anger, fear place at the bottom, and then come out through the end with a sort of acceptance. And I think, in terms of how people are dealing with it, they will be mentally going through a range of emotions, and I think it's important to recognize that people will be at different points on that curve at different times. They could go backwards, having made some progress. Let's say another lockdown happens, or their liberty's been taken away even further, than restrictions from 4 people to 2 people or no people or whatever it may be. So people will be moving along this, and I think that's the most important part, is to recognize that whilst you might see some mental behaviors, sort of a reaction in your mind that comes out in a behavioral form to this change, you may see that coming and going as you communicate and you interact with your employees. So at the beginning, when there's shock and denial, you will, from a business psychological perspective, in order to maintain some mental stability, I would suggest having lots of communication, lots of information given. This is how we're moving into the workplace. This is what it will mean for you. We'll be listening to you. If you feel that doesn't work for you, then we will try to come to some sort of arrangement. That's how I would act at the beginning part of that curve. As you move into that dip, that's when you do a lot of watching and listening and supporting, because as I say, everyone is different. That would be the best sort of psychological advice as people come through that bottom part. And then as you go into the top part again, give people time to explore and adjust and accept the changes, and see how that lands. And then hopefully you're coming into sort of some commitment phase where you can celebrate the changes together, because we've all been through this.
Yeah.
But from a sort of occupational psychological perspective, somebody needs to kind of take ownership of the changes and, push through that through a communication strategy, if you like, and then people will individually be going through the mental changes on that journey, but they will have that overarching support from the organisation that says, this is where we're at, but we are listening to you and we are supporting you. I think if you go in this process collaboratively with a strategy, but still listening, then you should be able to reach a sensible point.
I think it's important, isn't it, that we recognise that each individual will have a different curve or will be on a different place in the curve, but also so is the business leader. And often we look to the business leader to try to help solve or address an issue, but it's important to recognise for business leaders that they're on their own curve as well.
Absolutely, that's a very good point, because we kind of forget. I've read so many articles very recently about how the role of the business leader has just changed so much and will continue to change, for exactly what you just said, Dave, because we are expecting our leaders to stand up and be visible in a way that we haven't expected them to be before. However, behind them, in their own context, you just need to go back to the slides before, they're also dealing with anxiety, perhaps loneliness, whatever else is going on in their head. So they need the outlet. They need to be able to feel confident that they have a place to go with their own mental health, because I think that's really important when you're looking after other people in an organisation. So this, thanks. So this is quite a nice slide, which sort of addresses that from a sort of occupational psychological perspective, which talks about our mental health as an asset, and really looking at it from 2 sides, from the organizational's mental health and then from the individual's mental health. So if we ask the question of most people, do you think having good mental health is an asset? Then most people would say yes. And if we ask them, is it an asset worth working on and making sure that you keep it at a good stable level, then most people would say yes. And then you get to an organizational perspective where you think, well, am I prepared to pay for it? Because it's an asset on my balance sheet that actually, if I can get my employees to be a nice, stable, happy, good mental health, they're probably likely to be more engaged and more productive and more perform well. That's ultimately going to be better for me. So most people would say yes, and then they'd think, oh, actually, that's the cost that I can't really see, because all you have in terms of your return on investment or value on investment is those key stats that most people use, which is, sickness figures or sickness figures. I was going to say burnout, but it's more sort of people leave the company, so they get so burnt out that they eventually leave. So what's your retention policy? And really the equation here, which is a sporting metaphor, but it was about performance is potential minus interference. Like if we look at interference from a mental health perspective, if you can try and stabilize any interference in regards to mental health, then that is probably something worth considering from an individual perspective, and then collectively as a group. I think it's important at this point to say that mental health, it's not as simple as what I'm suggesting. There are age factors, sex factors, genetic factors, hereditary factors. Are you more predisposed to having poor mental health based on your genetics and your home, and then on top of it your environment? These are all things that contextualize the person. So changing someone's mental health is not as simple as it seems, but recognizing that people come with their own mental health journey, how can we manage that interference in order to get the best performance out of them is probably worth considering in terms of it being an asset.
Lisa, can I just ask you then, on that premise, what would you recommend? I mean, in terms of the business's role in addressing mental health issues, what are the practical steps that business owners should be considering taking?
Yes, this is a great question, because it kind of falls upon the extent of the moral and the ethical and the sort of corporate responsibility that businesses have to look after their staff. And it's such an interesting debate. I think to most levels, organizations want to look after their staff. Of course they do. I think they need to put into place some very basic plans which will be able to at least stabilize the mental health of their employees. And it can just be about the value system that you create, your mission, and in terms of the values that you adhere to and hold dear. And if you live them throughout the organization, so let's say you have collaborative working or compassionate working, then all of a sudden you interact with your colleagues in a way that lives that, which should be able to take away some of that work anxiety or some of that stress. So those are basic things, but to what extent does an organization need to provide something so that their employees maintain a good mental health? I think there is a responsibility for organizations to do that. I think, and this actually it's an interesting question from you, whether you've seen it through the recruitment industry. Do you think that candidates are expecting it now for employers to be able to say, these are my benefits, but actually I expect an organization to be able to give me access to good mental health providers because that's what I demand?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I have to say, I don't know if the guys will sort of jump in. I've not yet received information from my clients regarding those questions from candidates, but I suspect that we're going to hear them. I suspect that as we come back to work in this flexible working mode, that more and more people are going to be asking questions related to this particular subject, because I think it's a talked about subject. The interesting thing I feel about the lockdown is that prior to this, people rarely spoke about the mental well-being of their staff. If they did, it was often just lip service. But now I think it is very much something that's not only topical, but very important. And people have realized that, not least because most people, to an extent, based on your previous graph, as I was looking at it, I was thinking, well, yeah, I can relate to some of those things. I'm sure everybody that's listening could relate to some of those highs and lows on that graph. And I think because we're much more conscious of it as a nation, as employees and employers, I would imagine we're going to become aware of these kind of questions from candidates, and indeed employers considering how they're going to support their staff going forward. I don't know if the guys have experienced anything from their clients so far.
I certainly think that from a client point of view, and when we talk clients, we talk recruitment agencies. Some of my recruitment clients have been talking about putting more mental health structure into their business. But with regards to their clients, the end clients where we're recruiting for, I think that's going to be part of that benefit package that most people go into. And to sort of coin a phrase, whether it's a tick box or whether it is actually something that actually abide by and do properly, that will tend to sort of develop the company and say, right, is that company living by that mission statement, the value statement, or is it just a tick box exercise for them? We've got lots of questions that are coming in that sort of are covering sort of round about this, but I think a lot of the questions that are coming in, hopefully we can start to cover in the sort of the next sort of slide and stuff like that, because I think what we're looking at is, if we don't address these type of things, what risk to the business is there if we don't address those type of things? So therefore, if we don't put these mental health procedures in place, does that have a problem to the business moving forward?
Yeah. Sorry, Dave, did you want to say something?
That's fine. All I was going to say was to Ad's point, one thing we've learned about COVID is that it's okay not to be okay, and therefore we can talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually in some ways a real benefit. There's been so many obstacles in the way that, we need to kind of address, and stigma has been a huge obstacle, and I think it continues to be an obstacle, but it's definitely being broken down now. You just see in the news all the people that are campaigning behind, wider recognition of mental health issues. And you're right, it's okay not to be okay. Yeah, just in terms of, looking at your business, mentally healthy workplaces, I put here, will win. I think really the point there is that people are expecting organizations to be able to at least not pay lip service to this anymore. This needs to be imbibed in the culture of organizations, however you do it. And it may well be that you can't afford, or you don't see the value in having, an external provider so that your employees have places to go, and that you want to kind of do it internally. And that's fine if you've got the skills to be able to do that. You just need to be able to give your employees access to the help that they need, because ultimately it's like any relationship. If they feel looked after and loved, then they're going to work for you, and they're going to work really well. And so, I've put on this slide here sort of 3 categories. I think if we asked ourselves individually, and again, it's about applying something individually or about applying something as an organization, which bracket am I in? Am I in suffering? Have I had an immediate trauma and bereavement? Are we in this post-pandemic stress situation? Well, perhaps not immediate bereavement, but we are in a post-pandemic stress situation. Am I struggling? Do I have burnout? Well, somebody told me the other day that I'm going to burn out from doing too much, which I'm now going to be watching that. Or am I thriving? Even if I were thriving, this work-life imbalance is still happening. When is it just going to stop and just, readdress the situation? And I think that we do need to have this onus of responsibility from a corporate perspective to look after our employees in a different way. And we have been doing it, and we will continue to have to work alongside this sort of change culture, which is happening in the wider field. People are trying to break down those obstacles, break the stigma of accessing mental health, increasing the opportunities to communicate with your colleagues or your line manager, or even accessing external providers in anonymous situations. We have an anonymous service, which is one of the things that people liked about our service, because they don't feel that they have any stigma attached to accessing it, and so that's really useful. I think it doesn't matter really where people access help, so long as they feel comfortable to be able to do it. I think the organisation has to be able to say, this is what we believe in you, our staff, and we're prepared to help you, and this is how we're going to do it. We can offer you X, Y, Z, but beyond that, you need to get help elsewhere. Sorry.
So some of the questions that are coming in then is if you were an employer and you weren't offering that, are you then going to be deemed as a bad employer or an unsupportive employer if you're not offering it to your staff?
Well, that's an interesting question. And, it goes back to the conversation that you were saying before, which was about the size of the organization. If you're a reasonably small business, the concept of spending X amount per person per year on an external provider might fill you with horror. But it doesn't mean that you're not a compassionate employer that, has the mental well-being of your employees at the heart of everything that you do. So I don't think that if you don't provide it, it means that you're a bad employer, because I think you can counter that with the communication that you do about how we treat our staff, how we have our interactions with them, at what point are you able to address issues with us, if you feel that we're not quite, meeting your expectations. It's about setting what I said before, which was the psychological contract with you as the employer and your staff, which is, this is what I'm prepared to do for you. This is what you need to do for me in return, but this is what we will do for you as a responsible, loving employer. It doesn't mean you have to necessarily pay for it. You just have to live it, if that makes sense.
Lisa,
but I've got a question coming from the audience here, Paul, which I think is really important.
Yeah.
So, as all recruiters, we're a fairly cynical bunch. And let's be honest about that. So one of the questions coming out, I'm not going to mention who the person is because I think that's unfair, is how do we avoid the cry wolf syndrome in these extreme and strange circumstances? Because we've all had that cry wolf syndrome where people cry wolf on lots of things. Well, this gives, open ticket to a certain degree. How do we challenge that? How do we cope with that?
Absolutely. I hear this all the time. I had a conversation with somebody else the other day and they said, what, do you want me to move in with them? It was sort of like, I have to support them so much that I've got to go and move in with them and, make their tea and everything. I hear where you're coming from as somebody who's been in business and somebody who's had the background I've had, and yet somebody who's now in this sort of mental health space. I really do hear what you're saying. And the quick answer is, and I think it goes back to the question before, which is how long do we let this business carry on without really seeing some changes? And it's a very delicate line. I think, there is a process that you can have in place, which is, I'm prepared to give you, the afternoon off because you feel like you're burnt out. I'm prepared to give you a little bit of an extension on that deadline because you've got some problems at home because the kids are about and it's been homeschooling, and I get it, you're under pressure. And I'm prepared to do, you can go through those stages, but I think if you match their performance and their mental health position against their objectives, then all of a sudden you're starting to build up a picture. Once those two work in parallel, which is these are the objectives and your performance indicators, which you may or may not be missing, and this is your mental health sort of path, which and these are the explanations. We can support you up to a point, but it's about that communication again. There will be a point at which you say, I've tried to work with you, but ultimately it's an organizational responsibility for you to perform in your job. These are your performance tasks that we will be measuring you on. If you can't do that, we will support you up to a point, but at which point we will help you find the right help that you need. But and this is about the contract. The contract is about, this is what I will do for you, and this is the scope of how I will help you, but don't take the mickey, because I also have a job to do, and the job of the organization is to ultimately be profitable. So you can't take the full mickey. I will be able to support you, but it will be in these confines and within these boundaries. In a clinical setting, we would set boundaries between the clinician and the therapist, if you like, and the patient. And you have a 45-minute session, at which point that's the end, and then I'll write up my clinical notes, because all of a sudden you get those boundaries that are very blurred. So it's about communicating, setting the boundaries, setting expectations for you as an organization, what you're prepared to deal with and up until what point, in an empathetic way. If it's clear from the outset, then you should be able to somewhat reduce some of those worries. I hope that answered the question.
I think it does, because I think it's one of those sort of things that a lot of recruitment agency owners are very wary of, that that person crying wolf could cause a huge ramifications in the business. But if you're dealing it, as you say, they're looking at their functional KPIs versus their mental health KPIs and how that works, then we talk about KPIs as key performance indicators. We also should be talking about that kept promise indicator as a KPI. What promises have you kept? What indications of them not hitting their promises to you, and vice versa, starts to sort of really sort of come into play. But obviously we're sort of running out of time. We're sort of, as always with these things, that the mental health ones are always an interesting conversation. So let's move on very quickly. Dave, you wanted to sort of jump in on this sort of question.
Yeah, I think actually, to be honest, Lisa, I think you've answered some of them, but it was just any last few tips in terms of what measures have you seen really good companies put in place for their employees?
Yeah, and this goes back to the question, which is, if you can't afford a mental health provider, what can you do? What's a tangible takeaway that you can do to kind of, make sure that your staff are kind of on an even keel? And these are just really simple occupational psychological tools. Anybody can do them, but there's a lot of data that supports that. Recognition, what gets recognized and rewarded will be repeated. So recognize their efforts, thanks for doing this piece of work on time. If you align it next to the values of your organization, so we work collaboratively, it's important for our service delivery team especially, so we'd say thank you so much for working alongside us in this way. You match it to the values, then that will get repeated. That's always worked out quite nicely. This business about opportunities, I think we're in the situation where we're going back into a hybrid workplace, whatever that means, and things have changed. But from an employer's perspective, it's nice for their employees to know that actually we're moving forward and there are going to be either learning and development opportunities or positive opportunities about the future. It comes back to that psychological element about giving people control and hope in their lives. So they might be losing a little bit of control, but we do still want to keep that element of hope. And that's really important for, nice, positive mental health. And then, just providing the activities that go alongside that. And then the ultimate one is support. Fundamentally, people work with people. The way you interact with each other is worth so much. If it's not landing right, if you feel that there are difficulties, those difficult conversations that need to be had, then, look at the research, look at some top tips, have those conversations in a really safe environment and support your staff. That's all you need to do to really find some easy mental health bits, I think.
And Lisa, just a quick point. I mean, we are well known in our industry is well known for when we think about providing additional benefits to our people, it's very often award trips and Friday night drinks and that kind of thing. I'm wondering whether, as we go forward, to your point about can we afford the cost of providing mental health, whether people will readdress the way in which they provide benefits. Perhaps we'll stop doing some things and we'll start investing in other areas, particularly around mental health. I think there's an issue here to consider for lots of business owners in terms of what kind of benefits will our people really want as we come into this new world of work. Will they be the same as the benefits we used to give them pre-COVID? And I think that will be a pause for thought for quite a lot of people. Do we realign them? Do we realign the benefits to give people what we feel they might need? And that might well be related to providing them with mental health care.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, at the heart of everything, at the heart of these relationship buildings that are important in any organization at any time is that communication, which we talked about, but it's the listening, it's the proper listening and assessment. So things change. In the last year, we've gone from being in lockdown to now possibly going into a hybrid world of work. What we needed at the beginning has changed now and probably will change in 6 months and 12 months. And it's that constantly taking a pulse survey effectively of the organization. Is this benefit of benefit to you? Is it resonating with you? How can we change? That is putting people at the heart of your culture and heart of the decision making that you do. And even engaging people at that level makes them feel empowered, and empowerment makes them feel slightly in control. And again, going back to things that are really good for your mental health, to feel that you have some influence on your environment, really positive in terms of engagement and productivity. So little hits like that should be useful and should see some positive gains in the organization.
If we look at this in a total sort of view, how big an opportunity is it for companies to actually get this hybrid working right?
Well, I think it's huge. I think it will be different for different organizations. So, it goes back to listening to what your employees want. It's interesting from your recruitment perspective to see if this is what people are asking for. Do they want to have a hybrid world of work? Are people sort of saying, I want to do 3 days in the office and 2 days at home? I think I don't know the answer to that. But I think if people get this right, it's about challenging the status quo. We had a situation where this is what we did as an organization before. Well, that's great. And it might have worked. And that's fine if you want to continue doing that. But things have changed. So it's now looking at what works now. We are in a completely different world. People's challenges and the work-life balance or imbalance they've been under, the mental health strains they've been under, the pandemic, the global threat, all these things will have made a difference to how they view themselves within the workplace, themselves within their teams. If people can get this hybrid working business right, based on what their employees want, then they've got a huge chance to succeed. Mostly because they're going to look like super great employers that are listening to their staff, and their staff want to work for them because they're super great employers. So it's as simple as that.
I think what you're saying there, before we sort of move on to sort of the key takeaways from here, is what you're saying is that you need to be asking your employees what they want, because what I hear from a lot of business owners is, I think we all need to be back in the office and we don't want to home work. I want this, I want that, rather than saying, this is what my business is asking for. And it's actually understanding, as you said, the pulse of the company and what's going on from there. So there's been an awful lot today, Lisa. We've talked about a huge amount. So let's sort of move that on to our final slide, which, a bit too quick there. Talk about some key takeaways that we can give our listeners to take away to implement.
Yeah, I'm going to address that issue which you just mentioned there, which was listening to your staff and hearing what they want to do. So I've actually heard this before, where people say, I want to go back into the office, it's really good for me, and yet that might not work for everybody else in the team. So then what do you do? Because you're going to have half the people that want to work from home and half the people that want to work in the office, and how do you manage that? And so people have started actually breaking down their projects and thinking, when do I need all my staff members to be there? So this is at the forming stage of a project, where you all need to get your job roles and your clarity and whatever. That's a good time to meet. And then you can all go and work externally if you need to. And then there are points within that project that you do need to come together, because being in a physical space actually has some benefits. So it's looking at the tasks that you have and how that best works. That might change project to project. It might change. For some people, they might be absolutely against coming into the office completely. So it has to be a bit of give and take. So you can't. There will be a point where you have to say, you do need to be, for the benefit of this project, in a safe environment. If they can get there if they've had their jabs and so on, and they feel that they can get there, this is the benefit for us all being in a room together at this moment. So I think, I've seen organizations that have just done it, like one group goes in, their group A, they go in for week 1, and then they're away at week 2, and that's when group B is in the office. There's lots of different ways that you can sort of break it down. But anyway, I think the key takeaways are, mental health is incredibly complex. And what I mean by that is, we all come to the mental health table, if you like, with our own history. We've got our own background, we've got our own different identities, different hereditary factors, different ages and so on, and all the environmental stuff that's happened. So we already come to any work situation with our own mental health, and it's incredibly complex. At what point different triggers can then give you a reaction, whether it's some anxiety, some health anxiety, some change anxiety, something going on in your life that's giving you sleeping difficulties, that's impacting on different parts of your relationships. It's just not that simple. So if we recognize that people are complicated, but we do recognize that having good mental health is an asset, what can we do to support giving our employees good mental health? And then the last point is, things have changed. Challenge your status quo. Whatever you had before may work now, which is great, but it may not. So listen to your employees, see what works for them, and try to find things that are manageable for you to either implement, if it's a values element within your organization, or with training somebody within your staff to be a mental health first aider or a wellbeing officer, something that you can find within your budget and within the constricts of your own employment, to be able to give your employees what they need. I think that's probably what I would say.
Lisa, thank you very much. That was, as always, very enlightening. As always, we try and cram everything into 45 minutes. As always, we fail because there is so much things, and we ask so many questions. If you want to get in touch with Lisa, her details are there on the screen for you. That just leaves me to say, guys, it's been, again, a very interesting sort of conversation. Have you got any more questions that you want to ask, or is there anything else that you want Lisa to sort of expand on that we've already sort of covered? I'll take that as a no.
We're all fine. We're great. Thank you, Lisa. It's been really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure and fascinating as always. Guys, next week, obviously, we're going to cover a completely different topic. I'll get that out on LinkedIn very, very quickly so you can see what that is. We are rolling these sessions very, very quickly this year because there's been so much to cover. Because as we start to come out of lockdown, as we said, that roadmap is now sort of well and truly sort of highlighted to us all. I think it's important that we all start to really push ourselves forward and drive that. So, as always, it's been a pleasure. Lisa, thank you. Dave, Paul, thank you. Paul Sharp will be back next week. He's on client site this week. That all this says. Thanks very much, guys. It's been a pleasure. See you all next week.
Take care, everybody. Bye now.
Bye-bye.